Hey everybody, in this video we're going to take a look at the pluperfect tense and think about how we can form it in the passive voice. So we've done this a few times with different tenses and trying to unpack how they all work. But the first thing we want to do is just make sure that we understand what voice means and what the difference is between active and passive voice in Latin and in English. So you want to remember that when we say voice, what we're talking about is basically how the verb is being used and whether or not the subject is doing something or something's happening to the subject. So, for example, it's the difference between saying I'm walking the dog and the dog is being walked by me. And now we've said this before, but you might pause and say, doesn't this mean the same thing? And technically it kind of does. It's in a similar vein, but they're not the exact same thing, even though they might sound similar. So when you say I'm walking the dog, right, and the dog is being walked by me, they're both, you're probably visualizing in both sentences a dog out for a walk, which is fine. Except when you say I'm walking the dog, you're using an active voice verb, right? The subject, I, is actually the one doing the walking, right? I am walking the dog. When you phrase it the other way and say the dog is being walked by me, now the subject is not doing anything. The subject is the dog. When you say the dog is being walked, they're not doing anything, right? Something is happening to the dog. It's being walked by someone. And we put the who's doing the action part, right, of a passive voice verb, usually with the ablative of agent, which is, the by me part. It'll be ablative either way, but that's how you know who's actually doing the action. So it is a slight difference, and hopefully that makes sense. But I keep bringing it up in these videos on passive voice because if you're not sure what passive voice means, it's going to be kind of complicated to understand what we're doing with these different tenses when we put them in the passive voice. So how do we form it in Latin? And I've said this before, but it depends on the tense you're using. So we talked about the first set of videos we did on passive voice were present, imperfect, and future. And it's because for them, the process of forming active and passive voice are basically the same thing. The only thing you're changing is the endings, right, using passive voice endings. For pluperfect, though, we follow a different process, and it's actually very similar to perfect tense, which is one of the previous videos we made. So pluperfect, perfect, they kind of go together when you're dealing with passive voice. And when we deal with future perfect, you'll see that's the third tense that kind of fits into this different pattern. But the idea is it is not at all similar to what you do for active voice. It's a completely different idea. So what do we actually do, right? If it's different, what are we supposed to do? Well, the steps look like this. And again, if you've watched the video on perfect tense passive voice, this will look familiar. You go to the fourth principal part of your verb and you add the imperfect form of essay, right? The verb to be. Now, this might sound familiar. And if it does, it's because we did this with perfect tense. So when you have a fourth principal part and the present tense of essay, you're dealing with perfect passive. When you have the fourth principal part and the imperfect of essay, now you're in pluperfect passive. So one thing you want to note, though, there is a catch, or at least something you want to think about. We've spoken about this before, but it's definitely worth noting and keeping track of. Since we're dealing with fourth principal parts, you have adjective endings, right? The fourth principal part is an adjective. It's a first and second declension adjective, to be specific, right? The participle. So since it's using adjective endings, you have to deal with gender and number. Now, we've spoken about this before when we did perfect tense, but it's really important. The gender and number of your fourth principal part needs to match your subject. So whatever the gender and number of your subject is, that's going to match when you're dealing with the fourth principal part. So you have to think a little bit and kind of change how you spell it depending on who the subject is. But here's an example, right? It's the same verb we did for perfect tense. Porto, portare, it means to carry. If you want to make it pluperfect passive voice, you go to the fourth principal part, which is portatus. And remember, it's portatus for masculine, feminine, and neuter. And you add on the imperfect form of essay, which would be eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, eran. When you do this, you're not saying I was carried, but you're saying I had been carried. Had been is the translation for pluperfect passive. So like I said, the fourth principal part, you have to pick the gender and you have to pick the number. It depends on your subject. So if it's all nominative case because it's a subject, right? But if my subject is masculine, I need to be using a masculine ending. If it's feminine, it needs a feminine ending. And if it's plural, I need the plural form. So that's why you're seeing here, when you get to the plural pronouns, we, you, all, and they, it's not portatus anymore, it's e-I-a. That's the plural nominative form of first and second declension adjectives. It's because my subject is now plural, right? It's either we, you, all, or some version of they. But this works no matter what conjugation verb you have. You're always doing the same thing. Go to the fourth principal part, you add on the imperfect of essay, and you have the pluperfect passive voice form. So let's think about the gender a little bit and look at an example. And again, this is a familiar one from a previous video. But if I were trying to say I had been carried, when I spell it, if the I, the subject, is feminine, it would be portata eram. And by the spelling portata, I know that the I I'm talking about is a woman or a girl. It's a feminine noun, right? The same would apply for masculine. If you said portatus eram, it still means I had been carried. So in other words, portata eram and portatus eram mean the same thing, but there's a gender element involved. So I know by the ending whether the subject is masculine or feminine. The same thing would happen if we pluralize it, right? So if you're dealing with third person and you're trying to do third person plural, they, right? If you're saying the women had been carried, it's feminae portatai, right? The endings match. If you're saying the men had been carried, it's viri portati. So again, you're changing the ending to match the subject. That's a really important part. It's really the only thing you have to kind of worry about or think about when you're dealing with pluperfect passive voice. So hopefully this makes a little bit of sense. Again, if you watch the video on perfect tense, it's the same idea. We're just using the imperfect form of essay. But the best way to do it is to see it with some examples, which is what we're going to do right now. Let's look at some Latin and kind of unpack where this pluperfect passive is and what it looks like. So these examples, again, come from the Road to Latin textbook, which is the one I use in my classes. And this particular chapter was talking about Aeneas, right? The Aeneid, and that's why you have these references to Aeneas here. But this first line, you have, it says Turnus, right? Turnus Aeneam timebat, quote, Aeneas a Latino benigne acceptus erat. So my verb is acceptus erat, the second verb, right? You're saying Turnus feared Aeneas, right? Turnus timebat Aeneam. He feared him because Aeneas had been welcomed. So acceptus erat is pluperfect passive voice. You can tell because you have a fourth principal part, acceptus. It's masculine singular because it's referring to Aeneas, right? His name has a Greek ending on it, but he is a guy, singular, right? So acceptus erat. And you have the imperfect form of to be, right? Erat. So that's how you know it's pluperfect passive voice, and you translate it as had been. So he had been welcomed, benigne, he had been kindly welcomed, you could say, or welcomed kindly, by Latinus. A Latino is your ablative of agent. But again, it's a pluperfect passive voice verb. Here's another one. You have Troia a Graikis in Kensa erat. So Troy, the city of Troy, had been burned, right? In Kensa erat. You have an A on the end of in Kensa because it's modifying or referring back to Troia, right? Singular. And you have erat, the imperfect form of to be, because it's pluperfect tense, right? So it had been burned, right? Troy had been burned by the Greeks. Here's another one. You have itaque Troiani a regina adiuti erant. So the Trojans had been helped, adiuti erant. Notice how there's a long I, right, on adiuti. It's referring back to Troiani. And then you have erant, which is the imperfect form of essay. This is pluperfect passive voice. So again, they had been helped. And here's one more just to finish it off. You have sed consilia Aeneae a regina audita erant at Dido errata erat. Now this one I picked on purpose because it'll show you how you can tell where a pluperfect passive voice verb is, and it'll help you not be confused. So the plans is the subject, the consilia. So you're saying the plans of Aeneas had been heard, audita erant. So the A in audita is referring back to the plans, the consilia. That's why they both have an A. They're neuter plural, okay? The erant makes it pluperfect passive. So audita erant, you have a fourth principal part plus the imperfect of the verb to be. It's pluperfect passive voice. But the second part of this sentence is something that catches my students sometimes. You have errata erat. Now, audita and errata are not the same thing. Audita comes from audire. It's a participle. It comes from a verb. So audita erant is pluperfect passive because you have that fourth principal part plus the verb to be. Erat is also imperfect of essay, right? But it's not part of a fourth principal part. Errata is just a normal adjective. It means angry. So you're saying Dido was angry. The reason I bring this up is, again, audita erant and errata erat look similar. So if you're not paying attention, you might think you're looking at some verb that you're just not familiar with or some principal part. That's not it. And the confusion comes from the fact that fourth principal parts are using adjective endings, right? So they kind of look like adjectives. That's the idea. So this is where you want to be careful. When you see the verb to be, right? And even if it's, present, imperfect, whatever it is, you always want to look to see if it's going with a fourth principal part, but it has to be from a verb, right? That's how you can tell. So Errata here is not a verb. It's not a fourth principal part. So you're not dealing with passive voice of anything. You're just dealing with a normal adjective. Again, the reason I'm kind of harping on this is you see this a lot and it can be confusing, particularly in this sentence. If you weren't paying attention, you might be like, oh yeah, I have another pluperfect passive verb. You don't with errata, erat. It's just the verb to be going with an adjective. So always pay attention to that. So that's really it for this video, right? If you want to practice this, again, reading through stories is your best bet. But the pro tip, as always, is Magistrula, right? You can go to Magistrula. You can set it up to give you charts where you're conjugating pluperfect passive. Or if you hit the sentences button, you can just get a bunch of sentences and set it to use pluperfect passive. It's a really good way to really lock down what pluperfect passive looks like, how you form it, and how you translate it. So the sentences are really the key part. As much as you can read, whether it's Magistrula sentences or just reading Latin or from a textbook, whatever it is, the more repetition you get on reading these in context, right, in actual Latin sentences, the better off you're going to be. So I'd highly recommend that you use Magistrula. Again, I don't own it. I have no connection to it. I'm just a big fan and use it in my class. So to recap this video, for pluperfect tense passive voice, we said again, passive voice is when the subject is not doing anything, something's happening to it or receiving the action, we might say. You translate pluperfect passive with had been blank, right? I had been seen, I had been heard, right? It's had been, and then whatever your sort of past tense form of your verb is. To form it, you use the fourth principal part and you add the imperfect form of essay, right? The imperfect tense of essay. That's how you make it pluperfect passive. And you want to pay close attention to the gender and number. It has to match. So the gender and number of your fourth principal part, when you're doing this, has to match the gender and number of your subject. So always pay attention to that. And like I said, your best bet is to practice, get as much repetition as you can. Good luck.